My name is Levison Wood. I'm an explorer, a writer and a photographer. I've walked the length of the River Nile, the length of the Himalayas, all of Central America. I've crossed over the Caucasus Mountains from Russia to Iran, and most recently I've completed a 5,000 mile circumnavigation of the Arabian peninsula, taking in countries like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the empty quarter desert. So I'm here to talk about my journeys, my books and my TV shows, and share the experiences with Student Pocket Guide. Enjoy.
Well, firstly, Lev, thanks very much for inviting us into your home. What an amazing room. It's like something off Indiana Jones. It's nice to see there's no mummified cats on the wall in here.
There's no cats, but there's a few other little creatures around.
Is there some creatures in here? Is there? Is it okay to start from the beginning and you tell us what it was like growing up as a kid for you?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a small village in the Staffordshire Moorlands, not far from Stoke-on-Trent. Both my parents were teachers, and they always encouraged me to be curious about the world and to take an interest in history, geography, travel. So from quite a young age, I always wanted to travel and to explore. So that was kind of an ambition that I had ever since. Well, for as long as I can remember, really. So, and I was lucky enough, my parents took me camping in Scotland and France and Wales and those sorts of places. So, nothing too exotic, but, from the age of 18, I was lucky enough to be able to go and, did a very cliche gap year and travelled, to places like Thailand and India and Australia, but just loved it. And actually that freedom of independent travel, of going on your own and making new friends along the way was what it was all about for me. And so from some pretty humble beginnings, I set off and decided that was what I wanted to do with my life: see the world, document it, to write, to take photographs, and that's what I've been doing ever since. Amazing.
And you studied history at the University of Nottingham. I wanted to sort of ease the interview in with a little game, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit random, but I've got some old historical words and I wanted to test if you know what they are.
Right, okay.
And if you don't, you have a guess.
Okay.
So these are old historical words. The first one is snollygoster.
Snollygoster. Never heard of it. Not a clue.
No,
Go on. Educate me.
It's a shrewd, unprincipled person, especially a politician.
A snollygoster. I'm going to use that one.
Peg puff.
A peg puff.
Yep.
Okay. Again, no, that's new for me.
A young woman with manners of an old one.
Right.
Fudgel.
Fudgel. God, this is all. Go on. I don't know that one either.
Pretending to work when you're not actually doing anything at all.
To fudgel about. Okay.
To
I'll
fudgel
use
about.
that one as well.
And the last one, trumpery.
Trumpery.
Have a guess, go on.
Trumpery. Something to do with hubris, maybe.
It's things that look good, but
Yeah.
are basically worthless.
I mean, that's pretty much it, isn't it? That sums it up.
Random. So, you joined the army.
Mm.
What skills did you take from being a soldier into your expeditions that you go on? What were the key skills that you learned from the army?
It gave me a sense of confidence and being able to be in any situation, to push yourself to, beyond your limits. Before I joined the army, I had no idea that I'd end up in the parachute regiment, considered one of the most elite units in the world. And that was just through going through the military academy at Sandhurst, being pushed and tested, and actually finding my way. And actually, I think what I learned from that process was actually people are far more capable than we ever give ourselves credit for. And I think, there's the practical skills of being outside, of survival and that sort of thing. But actually, I think the most useful side of being in the army is actually when you leave is the network of people. The army very much is a very solid, brotherhood of soldiers. And when people leave, people look after each other. And so whenever I go on an expedition, go to new parts of the world, there's always somebody, an ex-colleague or a friend from the army who's out there doing something, whether that's working for a charity or an NGO or part of the government. So it's just a really useful network to have.
Amazing. And your first TV documentary, Walking the Nile, 4,200 miles across 6 countries. And when I watched it, you said that you had to stick quite close to the river, or you wanted to stick quite close to the river, but the hippos were a threat to you.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
Was that the biggest threat in terms of wildlife whilst you was walking the Nile?
The biggest concern for me, hippos they are considered to be one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, just because when they get angry, they do account for quite a lot of people that get trampled, basically. Having said that, I think psychologically it was the crocodiles, because hippos, you can kind of see them coming. They can outrun you, but at least you can try and do something, whether that's climb a tree or whatever. And I did actually get chased by a hippo.
Really?
But psychologically it's the crocodiles, because you sort of, they're there but you can't see them. So whenever you go and get water from the river, or you want to go and bathe or whatever, then you're always thinking, is there a crocodile waiting in the shallows to drag me in? So it was quite nerve-wracking at times, and something you always think about. And actually I met lots of people that had lost friends and family members to crocodiles, so it's a real threat. But at the same time, for me, this was also an opportunity to raise awareness about conservation issues. So I was trying to sort of balance the fear with actually raising awareness about protecting some of these species in Africa, including crocodiles.
Okay. And obviously the weather is a massive factor of the expeditions that you go on. And really sadly, the American journalist Matthew Power died, lost his life. Very, very sad. When that happened, did it make you think twice about continuing the journey?
Yeah, it did. I mean, when something like that happens, you obviously reassess and reevaluate everything. And it was a huge tragedy that happened. There's nothing we could have done. And, I did think twice about, do we carry on? But I thought, I've got to carry on to sort of, for his memory and his legacy. And I just didn't want to give up halfway through.
You went through Bor, a no-go zone, known for mass killings, executions, rape, torture. And you were stuck late at night whilst the rebels were fighting and attacked a building next door and killed 60 people?
That's right, yeah.
I mean, that must have been terrifying. Was that like one of the most terrifying moments of walking the Nile?
Yeah, that certainly was a moment that I'll remember, being surrounded by these rebel soldiers, and we'd heard the stories, and when we knew that they were coming to attack the town, there was nowhere to go. It was a choice between trying to swim across the river, but full of crocodiles, or climb onto the roof and at least you get a vantage point and see what's going on. So we climbed onto the roof, and you could literally see the tracer fire going over our heads, and you could see them getting closer. But the government troops fought them off, so we managed to survive to see another day.
And you just kept your cool, waited?
Just had to wait, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
You're constantly pushing yourself for all the expeditions that you go on, and on one occasion, again, walking through the Nile, you almost ran out of water. You're aware of these risks before you go on these expeditions, and how do you look at those risks? Do you worry about them, or do they excite you?
Risk is a part and parcel of being on an expedition. It's something you can't avoid. You can do everything within your power to mitigate it, but inevitably when you get on the ground and you find yourself in a situation, it doesn't always come out to plan. Wells that you think are on the map, you get there and then they're dry, for instance, or your guides get lost, and that happens a lot too. So for me, it's a case of you plan to the best of your ability, but you've also got to be prepared for when things go wrong, and you've got to be ready for that. And when we walking across the Sahara Desert, we came very close to running out of water, so we're very lucky to eventually find a very old well that had been sort of hidden away by the Bedouin, but we found it. If we hadn't, then it might be a very different story.
The next documentary that you filmed, Walking the Himalayas, a 1,700-mile trek through harsh environments, endless amount of risks here, avalanches, altitude sickness, monsoons, terrorists, bears and crocodiles and elephants. How much training are you given to face these unpredictable risks?
Well, for me, walking the Himalayas was sort of an evolution. I'd walked the length of the world's longest river through Africa. The Himalayas obviously very different, going through the mountains there, but again, lots of risks. I trained in terms of being in these sorts of environments. I'd done some mountain climbing with the army. I'd spent quite a lot of time in Nepal. I knew the route quite well. I'd been to Afghanistan. So for me, I was in the best position, a good position as anyone to do this journey. And, inevitably, though, it's the things that the slightly less glamorous things that are inevitably the most dangerous, the things that are getting ill, and ultimately the closest I've come to real tragedy was when my car was involved in an accident. The car went flying off a cliff when the brakes failed. So that's not something that you can really do much about. So you do what you can, but in countries like Nepal, where road safety isn't exactly you know, the priority, you've got to be very careful. But these things happen.
Do you mind talking about the accident?
No, it's fine, yeah.
I mean, what are your memories from when that happened?
Well, the memory was simply, you know, we'd finished walking for the day. There was nowhere to stay in this village, and we were told that there was another place 5 miles away. So we thought, okay, we're going to jump in a taxi, go to the town, and then come back the following day to carry on walking. Got in this taxi, and just as we were going over the top of the mountain pass, the brakes failed. I heard the sort of the brake cable snap. Car got faster and faster. It was night time. And I thought, this is it, because those roads and those cliffs, you know, this was right on top of a mountain, sheer drop into a river below. So, you know, the car went flying off the edge of this cliff into the forest. It was very surreal, because I was convinced that was when I was going to die. It bounced and rolled probably 10 times, and when it finally came to a halt, I was just I thought perhaps I was dead. I had no idea. But my first thought was, Binod, my guide, was in the car. My brother was on holiday visiting me. That was day 2 of his holiday. I had to find them, but I couldn't move because my arm was pointing the wrong way. And so it was, and then it took 3 days to get rescued because it was the monsoon season. So the local villagers luckily heard about, they must have heard the bang and the crash, and they carried me to a local village, and there was a makeshift clinic there, which was lucky, just a few miles away. So I was there for a few days. Not much they could do because they didn't have the equipment in the facility to fix me up. So it was actually about 10 days before I managed to have an operation on my arm.
Wow.
Yeah, it's all right, still there.
I was going to ask, how is it now?
It's full of metal, and I've got a pretty impressive scar that goes sort of all the way up, but it's...
Does it cause you any pain now?
No, it's all right now. It's all right, actually. I mean, it's my shoulder's still not as good as it could be, but I was very lucky.
So you returned to the UK for medical treatment, and then went back to Nepal. Obviously, you met the people that saved you. What was it like meeting them?
Well, I mean, because I was up to my eyeballs in morphine the first time around, it was quite nice to go back and to say thank you properly to the people that had saved my life. So, it was really emotional for me to go and see the car as well. It was still there, probably still is to this day. In fact, I'm going back to Nepal later on this year to go and take my brother back out because he's not been to Nepal since then. So on, and hopefully I'll get to see the people still in the village. So yeah, it's Nepal will always have a very special place in my own heart, because it's I've spent a lot of time there, and it's a place that I had that particularly important moment in my life, but still here.
Is there anything that would have stopped that finish line in Bhutan?
No, not really. I mean, for me, I was determined to finish. It was kind of I knew that if I didn't get the second expedition right, then nobody wants to be a one-hit wonder.
Definitely wasn't that. I mean, the next massive expedition, Walking the Americas, took you through 8 countries from Mexico to Colombia. And it was the first trip I'd seen where you started and ended with the same guide. That was really, really nice to see. And not only was it a guide, you were friends, aren't you? It was Alberto.
Yeah, Alberto, yeah.
What was it like for yourself completing the first expedition for the documentaries with a friend?
Yeah, I mean, Alberto, he's still one of my best mates. He's
an
incredible guy. I'd actually met him a few years before when I was just visiting Mexico. When he was a photographer, we got lots in common. So he was the first person I wanted to come with me, and he was up for it. He'd been through a bit of a crisis himself. He just got divorced, and he was at a loose end. So he's like, you know what, I'll come with you, and good on him. So he'd never walked anywhere in his life. For him this was a huge challenge, more so than for me, because I'd already done these 2 expeditions before, but he just wanted an adventure, and he'd never been to most of the countries in Central America outside of Mexico, so it was all new for him. So he wasn't so much a guide, he was just a walking companion, and just great company. And for me in particular, it was just really nice to actually spend in 6 months of walking. I don't think we fell out once. We just. I think if you can find a companion like that to travel with, then it's really makes the journey. And for me, out of all the journeys I've done, that was, it was certainly the most fun, just because Alberto was such a great character.
Brilliant. And you also, whilst on that expedition, you discovered a hidden pyramid in the jungle. I wanted to ask you, do you know the answer to, or could you guess as to how much of the world is undiscovered, not on Google Earth maps, and not in any guidebooks?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I love history. That's what I studied, and for me, these journeys are a good excuse to go and indulge in my passion, to go and see places, like the pyramids in the Yucatan, or any of these historical and archaeological sites. So it's a bit of a hobby for me, and whenever I find something like that, I just think, wow, isn't it amazing to be possibly the first person to set foot on this thing in hundreds, if not thousands of years. So, it goes to show that, we only really know a very small percentage of what's out there. There's lots of places that have perhaps, just been off the radar for millennia. And certainly those pyramids in Mexico, only a tiny proportion have been excavated. A lot of it's just down to funding. The government can't afford to excavate every single pyramid, so they concentrate on 2 or 3, the bigger ones perhaps. But actually the one I found was bigger than most of the ones that the public go to. So, and it's there just in the middle of the jungle, so who knows what else is out there.
And obviously on these expeditions you met a lot of tribe members. I was really interested to see that one of the grandfathers that you met was 90 years of age, but he looked so fit and healthy. And I just wondered what you thought is the answer to that such healthy lifestyle, because they come from very poor backgrounds often, with really limited resources, but yet they're very happy and live sometimes to very high age. And I just wondered.
I found that so often it's in these very remote communities that you get the longest lifespan, and I think a lot of it is down to just eating simple foods, eating healthily, not eating all the rubbish that we often do in the West. Living outside, maintaining a routine and generally being pretty healthy. And you find that, I found that in places like the Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan and certain places in Central America, where people are outside. That tends to be, a lesson really, I think, for us. We spend a lot of time inside looking at computers and, not potentially eating as well as we could be. So, I think there's a lot we can learn from communities that we often sort of write off as being, remote or primitive. Actually, there's a lot we can learn from them.
Absolutely. In Costa Rica, you met some migrants and heard some horrific stories of them trying to make it to the US. And it was a really emotional part of that programme. And I wondered how that felt, not only hearing the stories, but knowing that there's not much you can do about it. Because you've obviously, you meet these people, you hear their stories for however long, and you've just got to walk away knowing that you can't have any impact at all on the situation. Well,
it's hit the news, in the last sort of 6 to 12 months about the caravan going through Central America to people, these illegal immigrants trying to get to the United States. And when I was there in 2016, it was when it was just forming, and there was a steady trickle, 25,000 people annually. But now it's a lot more, and it is tough because you see people from all over the world living in very basic conditions. It's a tough one to get your head around, because on the one hand, you look at the people and ask, how have you done this journey with no money? And the stories of survival and resilience are quite incredible. But I have to say, the vast majority of the people that were heading to the United States were they were economic migrants. They were people that wanted a better life, for better or worse, and people, you can sort of judge that or not yourself. Most of the people weren't necessarily fleeing conflict. They weren't fleeing anything other than poverty. Now, it's up to people to decide whether or not that constitutes the right to travel somewhere without a passport, without visa. But, what struck me was the sense of determination of people that, I'm going to go and give a better life for myself and my family.
And of all the places in the world you could have been, you met a guy that worked on the London Overground, lived in Stratford, and you met him in the middle of the jungle.
That's right, yeah. He was from Pakistan. But yeah, he was basically working in the UK illegally and been deported back to Pakistan, and then eventually found himself in the jungles of Panama trying to get to the United States. But it goes to show that the lengths that people will go to find somewhere to live.
So we fast forward to the 4th Channel 4 documentary, From Russia to Iran. You're clearly a very determined and positive person, But it was funny because I watched the programme and it seemed to, your smile seemed to sort of drop when you was offered the gherkins.
Oh, I can't stand gherkins.
You can't stand gherkins. So I was just a bit of fun. I was just wondering, what would you rather do, eat a jar of gherkins or stay a night in an icy mountain with no food?
Give me the icy mountain any day of the week.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can't. Even the thought of gherkins it sends a shiver down my spine.
Sorry, I'm with And you seem the type of guy that doesn't ever hesitate. I don't know if that's fair to say. I don't know if it's true, but that's my impression. You don't ever hesitate in situations, and it made me smile because there's a certain scene where you have the oil bath.
Oh yeah.
And then you put it all on your face, and it wasn't until you was completely covered in the oil that you asked how to get it off. And I'm just wondering, like, if anything phases you. Does anything phase you at all?
I mean, I'm of the sort of mindset that, you know, if you're going to do something, just go all in, really, and that's been my attitude on these journeys, particularly when it comes to trying out new cultures and doing new things. I think you just get stuck in. You know, why not? So I try not to be too phased by things. Having said that, you know, like anybody, you know, there's certain things that do sort of terrify me a bit. Ironically, I'm not a huge fan of flying, so yeah, I mean, I was in the parachute regiment, but I don't particularly like heights. Certainly not like jumping out of planes. But you know, I think it's part of what we do as human beings is try and overcome fears and put ourselves and face them. Really, that's what we can do.
And you can walk from country to country.
Exactly, I can prove. If you don't like flying, just walk.
Just walk it. So let's talk about your most recent 5,000-mile expedition travelling the Arabian Peninsula. It's coming out on TV soon, is that right?
That's the plan. Yeah, we're trying to find a place for it to go.
Okay.
It hasn't got a station just yet, but watch this space. Yeah.
Before you left for this expedition, what were the biggest risks on paper?
Well, this is potentially the riskiest expedition.
Is it really? Yeah.
I think so. You know, in terms of the region is usually turbulent and unstable. You know, now more than ever. It's faced with conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Not to mention all the bureaucratic hurdles to get through just to get access to half these countries, like Saudi Arabia, like Iraq, and so on. So it took a long time in the planning. There was lots of things that could have gone wrong, but you know, I've got a really good team that were helping me out to sort out the logistics and the security and so on. So yeah, we embarked on the journey. The idea was to circumnavigate the peninsula, lots of walking, but also travelling by camel. You know, local transport, usually sort of hitching a lift on the back of a battle tank and things like that. And you know, it had some really hairy moments. I was embedded with Iraqi fighters who were fighting against ISIS in Iraq.
Whilst the fight was
Oh yeah, no, it was in the middle of the battle. It was right on the front line. We captured 3 ISIS commandos, liberated dozens of villages. So yeah, it was very intense. Yemen. The only way to get through Yemen was without a visa, so I had to sort of be smuggled across by a smuggler, and I was under the protection of one of the sort of rebel groups. I got thrown out of Yemen, so I ended up having to take a fishing boat around the coast of Yemen, across the Arabian Sea, which is the most heavily pirated stretch of sea anywhere in the world. I was meant to go up the coast of Saudi Arabia, but they weren't going that way, so I got dropped off in Somalia. Had to hitchhike across Somalia, and then travel all the way up through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and then the border between Israel and Lebanon has been closed for a while, so the only way to get through around there was through western Syria. So I was travelling under the protection of Assad regime troops and Russians at times, which you know, it's fascinating to sort of see. But you know, there are numerous times where I was embedded with groups that we'd often refer to as sort of the enemy or terrorists. I mean, we ended up having lunch with Hezbollah. So it was a fascinating journey, really, really worthwhile, I think, to sort of shed a light on a region that we only ever see a very small percentage of, usually for the wrong reasons. So that's what I wanted to do this journey, is to really try and understand myself some of the complexities of the Middle East, but hopefully showcase that for an audience, not through the lens of a war reporter or a correspondent, but very much through, you know, a traveller who's travelling at the mercy and the kindness of strangers.
Sounds amazing. I mean, what would you say you got out of that trip the most for yourself? What did you learn that you didn't previously know?
Well, for me, the journey was about, for myself, was to try and understand why there's so much conflict in the Middle East, why it's the most unstable part of the world, and to try and just grasp some of the complexities. I came away, I think, with more questions than I had answers, because it's even more complex than we even have, give it credit for. So it's a very difficult region, but I came away with some semblance of hope because of the incredible hospitality that was shown throughout.
Who were the biggest characters you met along the way?
I met everyone from an Iraqi sniper who'd been in every conflict since 1973. He killed 460 odd people. I met, dignitaries. I met politicians. I met soldiers. I met people who we'd probably call terrorists. The whole spectrum. Some of the friendliest people I met were just the simple Bedouin who lived in caves in places like Jordan and Oman, and they were the people that looked after me and travelled with me and got their camels, and off we went travelling across the desert.
Any issues with the camels?
Lots of issues with camels. Read the book for that one.
Oh, really? They didn't run away again?
Didn't have any run away. My guide almost ran away in Oman, but that's another story.
If you could go back to one part of the trip, what moment would you go back to and why?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I think Lebanon's a country I'd love to go back to. It's absolutely beautiful. I was only there for about a week to try to cross it. I'd love to go back and see more of, because it's just so beautiful. The mountains, the snow, the views, really incredible place.
Well, Lev, thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see the show. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Excellent.